digestion. So let's do a little review there and see what little tricks you might be able to come up with to help kind of make sense of the words, the hormones, and what their function is. Okay, now we'll talk about the 3 accessory organs. I don't think we're going to highlight too much the salivary glands. So gallbladder. Remember, the gallbladder is tucked right under the liver. So it stores bile, which is that fluid that emulsifies the lipids. So it basically breaks lipids down into these smaller globules that can then be better accessed by the lipid digesting enzymes. And remember, CCK is the message from the small intestine that signals the gallbladder to release bile. Also remember that it's the liver that actually produces bile. All right, the pancreas, this is a major accessory organ. So it makes, stores, and secretes all of most of the digestive enzymes. It stores them in an inactive form, so that once they're released into the small intestine, they can then become active there, right? Because we don't want the digestive enzymes working in the place where they're stored, right? It would be, I don't know chemistry well enough, right? But it'd be like, if you had a chemistry lab, or even just a lot of like home things we have at home, right? Like different solutions and stuff, or cleaning agents. It's like, you don't want those cleaning agents just acting willy-nilly in the closet where you're storing them. You want them to be inactive until you apply them to the thing you're cleaning or working on, right? So it's the same thing. We store them inactively, and then they become activated once in the small intestine. The pancreas also secretes insulin and glucagon. We'll talk more about these in chapter 4. Again, they regulate blood glucose. And again, the pancreas secretes the bicarbonate to neutralize the acidity of the chyme, because remember, the stomach produced that hydrochloric acid. And then the liver, so certainly one of the most important organs in the whole body, not just for digestion. We said, again, it produces bile to emulsify the fats. Again, bile is stored in that little gallbladder. Liver also can synthesize, so build chemicals for metabolism. We'll talk more about that in chapter 7. The liver, this is an important, so the liver kind of has 2 separate functions in digestion. The liver makes bile, which is secreted then into the small intestine by way of the gallbladder. But then the liver also receives all the end products of digestion via the portal vein. So once everything gets absorbed from the small intestine, it actually travels to the liver, and then the liver is kind of like the director and says, okay, you go here, you go here, you go here, right? And sends stuff back out to the body where it's needed. Glucose, the liver can also store glucose in the form of glycogen. So glycogen is one of our 2 forms of calorie storage. The other is adipose. We will talk more about that. The liver can also store vitamins. And the liver also helps to make some of our blood proteins. One last little overview of the GI tract and really the whole system. And this picture in particular wants to point out the hepatic portal vein. And so you'll see hepatic portal vein is attached, I mean, it's not showing the small intestine in great detail, but the hepatic portal vein is kind of greatly intertwined with the small intestine so that it's absorbing all those nutrients of digestion from the small intestine and bringing them back up to the liver, again, to be passed back out to the rest of the body. Okay, so remember, digestion was part of this process of how we deal with food. Absorption is the second step. So absorption is where we take the molecules into the cells that line the small intestine and then into that hepatic portal vein. So the molecules come across the cell membrane and literally enter the cells of our bodies, specifically the small intestine. There's a little bit of absorption happening in the stomach and the large intestine, but most of it is in the small intestine. So usually when we talk about absorption and when we break it down into these little cellular and subcellular components, we're talking about the small intestine. Remember, there's the mucosa. Those are the cells that line the small intestine. And we can also talk about, and then similar to the stomach, when we said that there's that mucous membrane, right, that protects the mucosal cells from the hydrochloric acid, same thing in the stomach. There's going to be this mucosal membrane that's right in front of these absorptive cells. So they have special structures that help to facilitate absorption in the mucous membrane. In there are these, well, kind of in there, this kind of all goes together. Now, there's a picture coming up, but villi is this term referring to folds in the lining of the GI tract. So these kind of like deep grooves. And basically the villi help because like food particles can kind of go in these grooves, and then it's much easier for the cells to absorb those nutrients. The cells that we're talking about are enterocytes. Enterocytes are the absorptive cells that are like in these deep grooved pockets in these villi. There's also something called the brush border, which is kind of like the surface of these enterocytes, which is composed of microvilli. So microvilli, so tiny folds, right? Remember, micro meaning small. So these tiny little folds right on the surface of these enterocytes, which function to really increase the surface area, meaning there's greater space across which to absorb all these different nutrients. And then we'll see that so the villi are making like these folds, right? So some of those folds are going to be pockets of the intestine, but then the other part of the fold is going to be that like extra space outside of the small intestine. So it's in those opposite folds that are created by the villi that we have blood vessel and lymph system kind of terminal ends. So capillaries and lacteals. And so once we absorb into the enterocytes, then it's a pretty quick passage out the other side to enter the capillary or the lacteal, which is the blood system and the lymph. Don't have a better picture than this one. Sorry. Okay, so here's what I was just talking about, the villi, right? So this is kind of like the inside of your intestine, and then you have like this fold is what we call a villi, but then you see it creates these deep grooves, right? That's what I mean by like one part of the villi is making this groove, and it's in this groove that we're going to do a lot of absorption, but then the other part of the villi is this space that is extra or outside, like actually outside of the small intestine. These parts are outside of the small intestine, right? And the red part is referring to the capillaries of the blood, of the cardiovascular system, of the blood. And then the, now I can't quite tell, the blue, let's call it, is the lacteal, so the lymph. Well, actually the green, sorry, the red and the blue are your capillaries. The green is the lymph. And then this is highlighting the enterocyte right here, which is the absorptive cell, right? So again, you've got these villi, which are making these deep grooves, and then lining the mucosal side, so the inside of the small intestine, you have the enterocytes, the absorptive cells. And then this is taking an even up close look at those enterocytes. And so here are the enterocytes themselves, right, absorptive cells with that brush border surface, right, all those microvilli. So again, microvilli, this is a smaller version, making these same kind of deep, deep grooves. Again, the purpose is to just increase the surface area and facilitate greater absorption. So then again, You see these enterocytes, so they're going to absorb the end products of digestion and then pretty quickly and easily pass them right into either the capillaries or the lacteals. Absorption can happen a few different ways, right? Absorption can either require energy or it can happen with no energy, meaning caloric, like use of calories. So two types of absorption that happen without caloric expenditure: passive diffusion and facilitated diffusion. You might recall diffusion from other bio classes. Diffusion just means along a concentration gradient. So moving from an area of high concentration to low. That would make sense, right? After a meal, there's going to be higher concentration of nutrients in the small intestine relative to the enterocytes. So a lot of nutrients are really just going to flow pretty simply into the enterocyte just by diffusion. So passive diffusion happens when nutrients simply cross into the enterocyte without a carrier or energy. So some of the nutrients that do that are lipids, water, vitamin C, and many of our minerals. Facilitated diffusion is still diffusion, so happening along the concentration gradient, but it's facilitated, right? It's sort of directed or supported. That means we need a carrier protein, right? Still no energy, but we need a carrier protein. One of the most famous nutrients that uses facilitated diffusion to be absorbed is fructose. Hopefully you can remember that because they both have an F, right? So fructose does need a carrier protein to actually enter the enterocyte. That's why some people like high fructose corn syrup or other, I feel like we've kind of reduced our use of fructose so much in sweetening, but maybe in the early 2000s or so, we did use a lot more fructose as a sweetener because we were thinking that it wouldn't contribute so much to caloric load because it's not as readily absorbed. But we find a lot of people wind up with a lot of GI distress from taking too much isolated fructose, and part of that's because it is slower absorption, so then it's just lingering in the small intestine longer. Okay, then the two types of absorption that require energy, there's active transport and then endocytosis. So active transport says active, right? That should pretty easily indicate to us that it requires energy and a carrier protein. So some of the nutrients that absorb via active transport are glucose, amino acids, and some of our minerals. Glucose and amino acids are two of the most critical, well, they're all nutrients are critical to the body, right? But glucose are the basic units of carbohydrate. This is like our fuel. And then amino acids are the basic units of protein. So we need the amino acids to build new proteins in our bodies. And then lastly, we have endocytosis and penocytosis. This is sort of like where a cell, like the enterocyte, will kind of engulf, like eat, and just like kind of like Pac-Man, like open up and eat the nutrient, or penocytosis, which we kind of refer to as drinking. But either way, it's active, it requires energy, and it's where the cells, again, literally kind of engulf the products and like absorb them then into the cell membrane. So we do endocytosis with some larger proteins and other large particles like antibodies that again we get from the mother's breast milk when we're infants. Here are the four types of absorption: passive and facilitated diffusion. So you'll see the main difference is the carrier protein, still working down the concentration gradient. Active transport requires energy and the carrier protein. And then endocytosis, you'll see the cell membrane will kind of like bow inward and just kind of then collapse and actually kind of section off cell membrane. Part of that cell membrane will just sort of like wrap itself into the cell, and that's how it gets absorbed. And then the third part we said of eating is transportation of nutrients and waste products. So transportation happens in the blood and the lymph, right? Blood is the cardiovascular system and lymph is the lymphatic system. We mentioned the capillaries, which are like sort of the the tiny little end spindles of the blood for the cardiovascular system, and lacteals are the tiny little end portions of the lymph. And they're tiny and they're kind of end portions because they're small enough to make their way into those villi folds and get really close to the enterocytes so that they can then receive the products of digestion from the enterocytes. So lacteals pick up mostly lipids and fat-soluble vitamins. The lymph system is more fat-friendly, I guess. The blood is water-based, so a lot of our fat or lipid molecules don't travel as easily. They do ultimately travel in the blood, but it's not as straightforward. So the lacteals pick up the lipids and other fat-soluble vitamins. And also in the lymph system, or the lymphatic system, is where we have lymph nodes, which are clusters of immune cells, which can relate to digestion, right? If we happen to absorb a microbe or other harmful agent, that would get absorbed into the lymph and perhaps be delivered to a lymph node where it could hopefully be degraded or broken down. And then the lymph system and the cardiovascular system work with each other all the time, right? So they're kind of continually interchanging particles. And again, both in the processes of nutrient transportation and getting rid of waste products. So let's talk a little bit more, let's kind of revisit the concept of the muscles of the GI tract. So remember we talked about peristalsis, which is moving contents from one area to another, moves contents from one area to the next. We said the esophagus and the large intestine do a lot of peristalsis. Segmentation is a different type of muscular action, happens primarily in the large and small intestines. And segmentation here increases the contact of the chyme with the digestive enzymes. So again, segmentation is a little bit of like trying to kind of helping with digestion. I mean, it's all helping with digestion, but segmentation is a little bit of mixing. And then we have circular, the two types of muscles we have are circular and longitudinal. So they contract and relax to mix the chyme and enhance its contact with the digestive juices and enterocytes. So here's peristalsis, right? Movement kind of linearly from one area to the next. Segmentation, again, we see this in the small and large intestine as we're kind of mixing stuff up so that the chyme, which is the digestive products, and the digestive juices can mix together. And so in segmentation, you see ultimately you get smaller and smaller and smaller contents of digestion, right? Another important facet of the muscles of the GI tract is this these Haustra, right? These segmentations of the colon, which contract kind of like peristalsis, but a little more slowly to move the contents along. So Haustra, there's a picture here. Oh, I don't have a picture of the Haustra. Your book does, I think. Sorry about that. Your book does have a picture of the Haustra. They're just sort of like rings. They look like rings along the colon. And again, they function similar to the process. They do peristalsis, right? So they help move the contents along, just a little more slowly. Mass movement is a term that refers to the movement of the waste products toward the rectum. So like getting ready for a poop, getting ready for a bowel movement. The rate of muscle contraction depends on where it is in the GI tract and to the presence of food. So you've maybe noticed that, right? Like, I guess I could say personally, in the morning, right? I think most people have a bowel movement or sometime in the morning. And maybe you pay attention, like if you eat something, just a piece of fruit or something, does that presence of food trigger a bowel movement relatively soon? You're not having a bowel movement of the fruit you just ate. You're having a bowel movement of some of the food you ate yesterday. And then there are also voluntary and involuntary muscles, right? So we have voluntary muscles in the mouth, right? That's pretty obvious, right? The muscles of the mouth. We don't just, you know, that'd be funny. Think about if your mouth just suddenly started chewing for you, right? No. Those are voluntary muscles, right? They're cognitively, consciously controlled. The muscles of the rest of the GI tract are not consciously controlled, right? They happen based on the presence of food, right? So we don't think, okay, stomach, start churning, right? Okay, pancreas, release your digestive juices. That's all happening involuntarily. The stomach has both longitudinal, circular, and diagonal muscles. Again, partly just due to the shape of the organ and because there's so much mixing that has to happen there. Whereas the small intestine and large intestine are much more tubular, so they primarily have longitudinal to move along and circular to do some of that mixing. Okay, a little bit more about the nervous system. So the enteric nervous system has to do with the digestive organs. It's a branch of the peripheral nervous system, which is part of the autonomic nervous system, right? The enteric nervous system, like when I referred to the vagus nerve earlier, it's localized primarily in that submucosa, remember, just behind the mucus, and also, of course, in the muscularis layer, because the nerve signals signal muscular contraction. So the enteric nervous system controls the contraction and secretions of the GI tract. Communication, so the enteric nervous system communicates with the central nervous system of the brain and spinal cord via the peripheral nervous system, right? So central nervous system is brain and spinal cord, peripheral is pretty much everything else. And the autonomic nervous system is composed, right, of the parasympathetic and sympathetic branches. So parasympathetic stimulation inhibits GI function. Sorry, I said that backwards. Sympathetic nervous system inhibits GI function, right? Sympathetic is like fight or flight, right? Where you're like, oh shit, I gotta run or fight this bear, right? So if you're running or fighting a bear, your body's not too interested in digesting. There might be food in there, right? If you just ate and then suddenly a bear is attacking you, or you just ate and you're stressed out about something in life, stress, it's the same system. So your digestion is gonna be impaired. Whereas parasympathetic, this is rest and digest, right? This is like, oh, cool, I'm calm, I'm relaxed, I'm eating my meal, my body can actually digest it, right? So parasympathetic stimulates digestion. There's so much more we could say here. Unfortunately, we could have a whole class on this, a whole like semester-long course. But read this section in the book too. It should give you a little bit more comprehensive understanding here. But again, just recognizing that there is really intense, really thorough communication between the brain and the digestive system. And the communication goes both directions, right? So if you're not feeling too well down here, you're not going to feel too well up here in your head. Similarly, if you're not feeling too well in your head, right, you're stressed, you're anxious, you're angry, you're upset, your digestive system isn't going to be going so smoothly, right? So that's really important. Our psychology and our physiology work hand in hand all day, every day. Alrighty, this would be another place to pause if you wanted to take a pause. Last thing we're going to do here for chapter 3 is talk about some digestive related disorders. So your book lists a bunch of them. Some of them are really kind of simple, like belching and farting, and some of them are a little more severe. So we'll start with belching and flatulence. Belching is burping, right? Primarily caused by swallowed air, which usually happens from eating too fast. You might also swallow air if you're chewing gum, or if you have braces or dentures, that might also impair your ability to really chew and swallow well. Flatulence is gas. It's also a normal process. We might have more flatulence if we're eating more foods rich in fiber, starch, and sugar. Some of that flatulence is again really normal, actually part of the bacterial fermentation of the fiber. But we can also have like excessive and sometimes stinky flatulence, especially if we eat too much added sugar. Again, a lot of the flatulence might come from the bacteria. And if you don't have a lot of flatulence, or if you have flatulence that's not odorous, that's probably a great sign, right? That you probably have really healthy, happy bacteria. And then some other components of our food, like Fat substitutes, so foods that might contain some trans fats, or foods that might contain, again, added sugar or sugar alcohols, are usually going to disturb the gut microbiome and cause a little more stinky and some maybe even painful flatulence. Okay, getting a little, well, flatulence can be a good early warning sign, but getting a little more severe, we have heartburn and gastroesophageal reflux disease. So remember that the stomach is producing hydrochloric acid, and the lining of the stomach has that mucosal barrier to protect it from the acid, but other parts of the GI tract do not have that protective mucosal layer. Remember, even in the pancreas, there isn't a protective layer of mucus. There is a little mucus layer, but it's not protective against the hydrochloric acid. It was that the pancreas secreted bicarbonate into the small intestine to neutralize the acid. So heartburn happens when the contents of the stomach do move backwards up into the esophagus. And so the esophagus literally gets burned by the hydrochloric acid. We call it heartburn because if you remember the image that showed the digestive organs, stomach's right below your heart, and the esophagus is right behind, it's right in the kind of in the middle of your your chest area. So that burning sensation is in the esophagus, but we kind of feel like it's in the heart, but it's actually in the esophagus. So that's why we call it heartburn, but it's really esophagus burn. So heartburn and GERD are directly related because GERD is gastroesophageal reflux disease. So gastrostomach esophageal reflux, right, backwards. So GERD is that like dysfunction of the gastroesophageal valve or sphincter. So that's where you get that painful, persistent heartburn. Let me say one more thing here. Heartburn could happen like once, like you ate too much and your stomach isn't digesting. Your stomach is digesting slow at its normal pace, but you put so much food in there, they're getting a little bit of like backward movement and back into the esophagus. So that could be heartburn once periodically. But then prolonged and persistent heartburn, it might be due to this reflux disease or GERD, or maybe that valve isn't functioning quite right. Or maybe you're just constantly overeating and constantly overstressing your stomach, so you're constantly getting that reflux. Or you're also eating things that you're not tolerating so well, and your stomach's like, get this out of here. That can also be a cause of reflux or GERD or heartburn. So this is just showing you again, your heart is like right here. Here's the muscles of your diaphragm. Your stomach's right there. Your esophagus is right there. So when you get that acidic passage of hydrochloric acid and chyme back into your esophagus, it burns right about in the region of your heart. So it has nothing to do with your heart, but we think it's there. Causes of GERD. So a lot of these, again, are behavioral. These are choices we make. The only one that isn't is having a hiatal hernia, right? Where you have like a hernia of the, kind of like an outgrowth of the stomach that actually passes through the diaphragm. That can hurt, right? So then you're getting pain in that region because of that hernia, pain in the heart region. Smoking or alcohol, being overweight. Pregnancy can also cause GERD just because as the uterus grows and grows and grows with the baby, it actually pushes and kind of collapses or condenses our digestive organs. So you might have greater incidence of GERD. Again, some foods that we just might overreact to. A large meal or a lot of fat in a meal, and also laying down too soon after a meal. So big takeaway from this slide is that GERD is very preventable, right? And if you have GERD, you can treat it yourself just by changing some of your behaviors. Okay, ulcers. So peptic ulcers are areas of the GI tract that have been eroded by hydrochloric acid and pepsin. So an ulcer, do I have an image? Yeah. So here's an image of an ulcer, right? So this inner layer, this mucosal layer, and even the submucosal layer of your digestive organ gets eroded, right? Like chewed away by the hydrochloric acid. There's also a bacteria that can cause this, which is H. pylori or Helicobacter pylori. Can play a role in both gastric and duodenal ulcers. Ulcers can also be caused by prolonged use of NSAIDs or non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. So just be aware of if you've been using an NSAID for too long and maybe switch to a different pain reliever that isn't an NSAID. And also some medications. Can use same medications to treat GERD. Oh, yeah. Right. So again, a lot of this has to do with the acid. So a lot of medications that would treat GERD or treat an ulcer are going to reduce your body's production of hydrochloric acid. Maybe not great to be on long term, right? Because you need hydrochloric acid for digestion, but certainly can be used to kind of treat a bad ulcer in the short term. We had thought for a while that maybe ulcers were caused by stress or spicy foods, and I guess in my opinion we can't rule those out entirely, but we definitely need to pay attention to the fact that they're most often actually caused by bacteria. So there's the peptic ulcer, and then other digestive disorders, so gallstones. So these are crystallized deposits of either cholesterol or bilirubin that form in the gallbladder. So that can also be painful, or it could be asymptomatic, meaning no pain or symptoms at all. But it can become painful if it obstructs the bile duct, so the little duct that connects the gallbladder to the duodenum, right? So the duct through which the bile passes. Unfortunately, treatment often involves removing the gallbladder, and so post-gallbladder, I forget what they call that exactly, gallbladderectomy. There's actually a word for that. But if your gallbladder gets removed, then usually the way your body will eventually adapt is that the liver will send bile into the duodenum via the common bile duct instead of via the gallbladder. These are some examples of some relatively large gallstones. You'll see compared to the size of a dime and compared to the size of like a chickpea, right? So really large deposits of bilirubin and cholesterol, some of them a little bit smaller, but you can imagine those could be quite painful, again, especially if they start to block the ducts. Also, let's differentiate between a food intolerance and a food allergy. So an allergy, I like to start there. A food allergy is like a real serious issue, right? It's where your immune system overreacts to a particular food or component of a food, usually a protein in the food. Right? So someone who has like a real allergy to milk, or what else do we have? Like a real allergy to eggs or peanut butter or bees, even. It's a reaction to a protein in that food. And so it can be really quite dangerous if the person does ingest that food, because the immune system responds, right, and can, it's a hypersensitivity and a hyperreaction. So the immune system might respond so intensely that it can be like threatening if not addressed immediately. A food intolerance is a little less serious, but an intolerance is basically a bunch of different symptoms that occur after you eat a certain food, right? So gas, pain, or diarrhea, right? So it's sort of like, well, maybe just don't eat that food, or eat it less frequently, or eat it in smaller portions. For whatever reason, your body isn't loving that food, isn't digesting it quite right or very well. So don't have it, or have it less frequently, or have smaller parts or portions of it. But a food intolerance, again, you're still going to see some of the like basic symptoms of your immune system working, but it's again just things like pain, maybe some bloating, like maybe a little inflammation, but it's not a full-blown immune response. Celiac disease, another pretty serious one. So celiac disease is where your body reacts to proteins in wheat, rye, and barley, which we commonly refer to as gluten. And gluten is actually a component of a larger protein called gliadin. So in this case, the body just does not tolerate gluten or gliadin, and we can see, again, kind of a full-blown immune response here. So far, we don't really know a cure for celiac disease, aside from just staying away from wheat, rye, and barley, these foods that contain gluten. As celiac disease progresses, what we see is pretty severe damage to those enterocytes that line the small intestine. And so poorly managed celiac disease can really interfere with or lead to poor nutrient absorption because those enterocytes are so damaged. The enterocytes are damaged, and also the villi decrease in size, which is really interesting, right? So those deep grooves that allow for better absorption, they just kind of shrink, right? So that's part of why nutrient absorption becomes less effective or efficient. Also worth noting, there is a sensitivity to gluten that is non-celiac, right? So kind of like an intolerance, right? So the signs and symptoms are non-specific and can vary greatly, and there are no precise biomarkers, whereas the slide doesn't say it, but there is a biomarker for celiac disease. So you can be very clearly diagnosed with celiac disease. So if you get tested for celiac and you're not diagnosed, maybe you just have sensitivity, right? So you still might get an immune response to gluten or other components of wheat or rye or barley. Non-celiac gluten sensitivity might also just be an intolerance to some of the short chain carbohydrates, which you've maybe seen this acronym FODMAPs, which is fructo, oligo, and disaccharides, and then polyols. So we'll talk a little more about that when we talk about carbohydrates in chapter 4. Again, in my opinion, this is usually an intolerance if you have kind of an intolerance to these fermentable carbohydrates. It's usually an underlying gut dysbiosis, so usually addressing, again, the quality of your overall diet as well as your gut microbiome, in my opinion, is a good way to kind of treat this for the long term. So, and again, I guess I kind of say that here. So if you have non-celiac gluten sensitivity, what you might look at is reducing the intake of processed foods, eat a greater variety of fiber-rich foods, which again would be different varieties of beans, grains, whole grains, fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds. Maybe also reduce meat and dairy, as these can also be inflammatory in the gut and cause, kind of exacerbate the symptoms here. Vomiting, right? So vomiting is, again, when we get that backwards peristalsis, where the contents of the stomach move back up into the esophagus. There's also something called cyclic vomiting syndrome. This is a vomiting that reoccurs for more than several hours or might even last for a few days. Crohn's disease. So Crohn's disease is another inflammatory bowel disease similar to celiac. The causes of Crohn's disease are also a little less well known, although oftentimes probably stress, again, brain to gut, right? Probably stress, probably poor diet over a long period of time, maybe not having frequent enough or productive enough bowel movements. Those potentially could be some of the causes. Maybe there's also a reaction to a virus or a bacteria, but again, in a healthy body, we should be able to pass that virus or bacteria out, at least within a few weeks, if not within a few days. So ongoing Crohn's disease, again, oftentimes you might consider the health of the gut and the healthfulness of what you're eating. So symptoms of Crohn's include diarrhea, abdominal pain, potentially rectal bleeding, could be weight loss, fever, and even anemia, which can be caused by a number of different nutrient deficiencies. So Crohn's may very well be due to an overgrowth of some of those harmful viruses or bacteria in the large intestine. And so then the person might really be having a hard time getting rid of them, because the way to get rid of them is to repopulate the healthy gut microbes. Ulcerative colitis, again, an inflammatory bowel or inflammatory digestive issue. So here the inflammation is part of the digestive tract. Chronic disease characterized by inflammation and ulceration of the mucosa The innermost lining of the colon, yeah. So ulcerative colitis in the colon, and could potentially lead to ulcers of the colon. Again, could be in response to overgrowth of harmful virus or bacteria. Similar symptoms to Crohn's. You might have to avoid certain foods for a little while. And again, a similar treatment of just addressing the overall gut microbiome and the healthfulness of what we eat. Diarrhea, right? So frequent, loose, watery stools not held together well. Common causes, again, could be an infection in the GI tract, a bacteria overgrowth or virus, stress, remember gut brain, again, a food intolerance as we just saw, reaction to a medication, or any of the bowel disorders we just looked at. Ongoing and really severe diarrhea can lead to dehydration. That's really important to look out for. So dehydration becomes really serious for children and elderly, right, who are more susceptible to dehydration more quickly. So look out for prolonged or really severe diarrhea in children and elderly. We can also sometimes get traveler's diarrhea, which again is often caused by a bacteria or a virus that our body isn't familiar with, and the body's trying to expel it, right? That's sometimes what diarrhea is trying to just expel a foreign particle. Sometimes diarrhea can also be improved ultimately by increasing soluble fibers, because sometimes we're having diarrhea, maybe not so much for any of these reasons, but just because our stool isn't really held well together. And that's the job of soluble fiber. We'll talk more about that in chapter 4. Signs and symptoms of dehydration in adults and children. So particularly again in infants and children, these are important signs to look out for. So maybe no tears when they're crying, not peeing frequently, less frequently than every 3 hours, a little lethargic, not having a lot of energy, sunken eyes, cheeks, or soft spots on the skull, dry skin, dry mouth. In adults, maybe more headaches or fainting. So look out for these signs of dehydration, again, especially if it's any time, but especially if there's diarrhea going on, look for these symptoms and help rehydrate the child or the adult. Constipation, the opposite of diarrhea, right? So having infrequent bowel movements that are usually hard, really small, like little rabbit pellets, and difficult to pass, right? So in this case, constipation is usually treated by increasing both soluble and insoluble fibers, which we generally get from fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and legumes. Also, fluid is usually lack of water intake, so poor hydration is usually a good cause of constipation. Also, lack of regular physical activity is often a cause of constipation. So again, behavioral changes can improve this one. And then irritable bowel syndrome, so kind of a collection of disorders that interfere with normal colon function. Symptoms would be cramping in the abdomen, right? You're not pooping, right? So you're going to cramp there. Might be bloating because you're probably not pooping, right? Usually constipation goes with IBS, but it could also be diarrhea. So if there's diarrhea, there might be a lot of, in either case actually, there might be a lot of inflammation along the colon, both of which can lead to that cramping and that bloating feeling. IBS is strongly associated with stress, again, gut brain. Excessive caffeine intake, which for a lot of people is just 2 cups, 16 ounces. Large meals for sure. Alcohol. For a lot of people, dairy and wheat. And some people, chocolate. So it's not even so much that we have to eliminate. For some people, we do have to eliminate some of these foods. But for a lot of people, it's even just having smaller portions or having them less frequently. Treatment for IBS typically involves stress management, getting physical activity, eating smaller meals, eating more fiber, again, from your whole plant foods, being better hydrated, and potentially, if it's wheat related, following this low FODMAP diet. Cancer in the GI system, so another disorder in the GI system. So cancer can develop in any region, right? The gallbladder, the liver, the pancreas. The most common is in the rectum, the colon and the rectum. Risk factors, so things that increase our risk for cancer in the GI system. Smoking, being overweight, not being physically active, diets high in red and processed meats. So again, not to say that red or processed meat causes cancer, although I guess we do know that they do, but especially if we eat a lot of them. So if we're eating red or processed meat every day, like steak or pig, or deli meats, those are common processed meats, deli meats, those are cancer promoting foods. As well as diets that are low in calcium, fruits and vegetables, and whole grains. These are foods that provide a lot of fiber and a lot of water, as well as a host of other nutrients that are provide antioxidation. We'll learn about that in Unit 3. So fiber and antioxidants are critical to actually slowing the process of cancer or even reversing the process of cancer and keeping that colon healthy and clean. So a colonoscopy can detect cancer or precancerous polyps, little growths in the colon, and screenings for colorectal cancers are recommended starting at age 50. Again, all of the risk factors for colorectal cancer are lifestyle. These are all modifiable. These are all behaviors that we each have the capacity to change. Okay, so that's it for chapter 3. The last bit here, as with all lectures, will be the little question and answer. So I'll thumb through these slides, pause them to kind of figure out the answer yourself, and then play to the next slide. If you have any questions at all, as always, please email me. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next for chapter 4.